All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Hopefully, you guys are having a good Thursday so far. And today, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Section 3 and the call for the rights of women. And if you remember back to History 7, we touched on a few major topics which culminated in the passing of the 19th Amendment. Today, we're kind of going to pick up where we left off in History 7 as far as the women's rights movement towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century as part of the progressive movement here. And I think this picture here, kicking off Section 3, is very telling, especially considering we're talking about the progressive era. And you see some of these signs, all right, Wilson is against women. President Woodrow Wilson was a progressive in many ways. However, he was very lukewarm when it came to giving women the right to vote. Okay, surprisingly enough. And this is a picture from 1917 of protests that were taking place throughout the country, picket protests with signs, not just in front of the White House, but in many major cities. So, although the women's rights movement gets started in the 1840s, it is still a constant conflict for women to try to attain that right to vote. All right, so calling back to our roots from last year, we had spoken about in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the women's rights movement at Seneca Falls, New York. Okay, there she had read and written out the Declaration of Sentiments, all the reasons as to why women have been deprived and neglected in society and why she felt as though there needed to be some semblance of change. We also talked about how Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, all right, started the National Suffrage Women's Association. The idea of starting a national group that went around making speeches trying to get women the right to vote. However, this was a controversial topic at the time. Okay, women's place had always been at home. They have come out of the home and into the workplace, but even still, while many workers in these factories, many workers in cities, one out of every four were women. So there are steps there from a cultural and a society change, but even still, the idea of women's right to vote was very much controversial. Okay, in 1869, Wyoming became the very first state to allow women the right to vote in state elections. Okay, so this is the first state to do so. Okay, other states by the latter half of the 1800s, including Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. So these are all things being done out west. And the reason why not so far much in the east in major cities and why out west is because as as families continued to push westward, women took on a more prominent role in some of these new states that were forming. So Wyoming is one of those states, the first one to set an example, and we consider Wyoming to certainly be a progressive state because of this. But even with states giving the right to women to vote in state elections, the question of national elections was a much bigger question. That was very much a hands-off topic. And by the 1900s, because other states were starting to do it, the suffrage movement began to grow. Okay, and there are many names and faces attached to this. Of the woman at this particular point in time in history to be the most recognizable name and face was Carrie Chapman Catt. Okay, and she's going to do a lot of things. She kind of piggybacks off of the Women's Suffrage Association. But for her, I have here in the notes, she looked to devise a plan. All right, and her plan was to go state by state talking about what democracy was, and then to further go on to talk about why, if a government is for the people, by the people, it's for all people. Okay, not just a selected group of people based off of the color of one's skin, not just based off of gender. Okay, so she is going to be adamant, and she starts a number of different groups. She works with the International Women's Suffrage Alliance in 1902, and she also founded the League of Women Voters actually in 1920, the year in which the 19th Amendment is passed. And the reason as to why she wanted to go traveling state by state was that her hope was, her end game was that she was going to convince states that women should have the right to vote at a local level, at a state level, and then the federal government, okay, would have to take a step back and say, wow, all right, women have the right to vote in every state. Why can't they have the right to vote at the federal level? So that there was some strategy there, okay, especially for her, as I've made mention of, the states in the West, all right, Midwest are the first, okay, to adopt this, and a lot of it is attributed to women like Carrie Chapman Catt. And as you can see here, a famous newspaper headline article from the New York Times. Okay, we're talking about Mrs. Catt's crusades, all right, around the world, so to speak, okay, in hopes of trying to get women the right to vote. So one of the most recognizable names and faces attached to the women's rights movement here at the turn of the 20th century. And by the early 1900s, while women do have the right to vote in many states, they still will not have the right to vote at the federal level. And that is going to be the biggest challenge facing women during this particular time period. With Carrie Chapman Catt with Carrie Chapman Catt out there making public speeches, another name to be familiar with is a woman by the name of Alice Paul. She was born in 1855, so her work with the women's rights movement here in the early 1900s, she is in her late 20s, early 30s. And she, like Miss Catt, are going to be very vocal in organizing a number of key events, okay, events such as parades, protesting the idea that women should have the right to vote, organizing protests outside even the White House. Okay, Alice Paul, in March of 1913, along with a number of other women suffragists, will meet with the newly elected President Woodrow Wilson, famously, and in their discussion, President Wilson told Paul that it was not time for women. That right now, in the middle of the progressive era, that a woman's time would come to vote, but told Alice Paul that it was not their time just yet. But they will get there, at least in Wilson's viewpoint. And Alice Paul took that as a challenge. Okay, so she would go on to hold a hunger strikes, and she had what was known as her silent sentinels, okay, which would picket outside the White House daily, okay, and this is going on during World War I, so there is a lot of criticism on the part of women who were protesting at a time when the United States was at war. There was a lot of verbal assaults thrown towards those women who were organizing those picket lines, okay, with those signs pictured at the beginning of the section. Alice Paul herself will be arrested for her involvement in this. She sits in jail for 7 months, okay, and a lot of women, especially in Washington, D.C., would be arrested not for a violation of freedom of speech, but rather for obstructing traffic. So it gets a little petty and ugly during this time period. By 1918, though, the United States coming out of, or hopefully coming out of World War I, President Wilson, more so because of political pressure, decided that it would be worth sending this conversation to Congress. Okay, and by 1918, finally, Wilson, 6 years after, or 5 years after that meeting with Paul, will announce his support for suffrage. Okay, and now the debate takes place inside the House and the Senate. Okay, deciding whether or not to pass that amendment. Okay, in 1920. We will see the passing of the Equals Rights Amendment, known as the ERA, that would guarantee women a constitutional protection from discrimination and the idea that they had the right to vote. Okay, so officially the 19th Amendment, as we know, is passed. Okay, and that is going to certainly change the complexion of the country, and the fact that now you have nearly half of the population now eligible, who previously weren't eligible to vote in a presidential election. So we had an election in 1912, 1916, Wilson will win re-election, and 1920 will become the first election in which women finally have the right to vote. And so for the Republicans and Democrats, certainly potentially a changing of strategy in their quest to be elected president. Yes, I think it's important to make note that yes, women will receive the right to vote. Okay, as we said, yes, you can kind of do like a check mark here. But as far as equal opportunities after the passing of the 19th Amendment and even before, as far as jobs and education, I would say it's not yet there. Okay, we've already made mention of even last year, schooling was available few and far between for women. Okay, but we start to see a lot of firsts here in the United States. Boston University, BU, becomes the first college to officially offer women the opportunity to go and receive a PhD. Her name was Helen McGill White. All right, so she becomes the first doctor to graduate from an American college to become an actual doctor, a physician. Okay, and by the 1900s, we are beginning to see the change of the tide of culture. Okay, where schools, women are staying in school longer. Okay, we're starting to see women being accepted to multiple different colleges where they study potentially medicine, becoming nurses, becoming lawyers by studying law. Okay, so that's a good thing as far as society goes, but it's also an opportunity for women to band together for a common cause. What we begin to see throughout the United States, especially in many major cities, is the organization of women's clubs. Okay, where these would be clubs that would meet to discuss women's place in society. Okay, and trying to get a stronghold and at least a foothold in society. This would be the reason as to why they would try to organize and raise money. Okay, trying to get local support, raising money for the construction in their towns or cities for libraries or parks and schools and museums and a whole bunch more. Okay, so many of these women's clubs did great things at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, things like this had always been common, but it's really the progressive era that sheds light into these clubs. And a lot of women who were associated with this took on the idea that it was a woman's job, okay, or more or less a moral obligation and responsibility to society to try to transform public policy, which would have obviously include federal policy as well. And what we begin to see is with this organized not just by white women, but also by African American women, okay, that will organize groups that discuss not just women's rights, but also equal opportunities for education. They'll talk about questions about child labor. They'll talk about environmental protection. Okay, so there's a lot of things when we think about these women's clubs. It wasn't just necessarily a women's rights to vote or a women's place in society. For these women, a part of this progressive movement, and it gets the title movement at this time. A lot of times it was just considered in the early 1800s a bunch of women getting together to look to make changes in society. This is a little bit different. And to provide a few examples, that's how we finish off the section here. A major concern in American society, and I would venture to say, and I'm going to pick up with this a little bit more tomorrow, and making it a little bit more relevant to the 21st century, is that in the 1870s there was a major concern, particularly by women, in regards to alcohol abuse. Okay, and the consumption of alcohol, intoxication for these women was not just ruining home life, okay, but also ruining society as a whole. So one of those clubs that gets organized during this progressive movement is known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, okay, or the WCTU. That's what this stands for here. All right, and a number of different people will be associated with this movement, okay, about the concerns of alcohol, okay, and this temperance movement, as we'll make mention of tomorrow, is highlighted with an actual passing of an amendment. Okay, so this is a movement that is very much becomes a major part of American society to a point where the federal government decides that it would be best to ban the sale and distribution of alcohol here in the United States. So this was a huge issue for the time period. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in class tomorrow. So here's the deal. Everything up to what we just made mention of is on your quiz for tomorrow. So it's a section 2 and 3 quiz, not including this slide. So well, you know what? There is going to be a question about the women's Christian temperance movement. So just be familiar with what that is, okay? And also be familiar with the 18th Amendment. But I'll talk specifically about Francis Willard and Carrie Nation as far as what they did for this time period. Because, again, I feel like there's a lot of parallels to make as well as concerns when we tie things into the 21st century. So quiz tomorrow. Make sure you study. Feel free to stop by today after school or tomorrow morning for any sort of extra help. Okay. In addition, I have left you guys an assignment in Schoology that I'm going to ask that you work on in preparation for your quiz to get through some of those questions. Assignment 4.3b. So use your notes, use your iBook to answer those. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to stop by after school. As always, please make sure you are saying thank you to your sub and make sure you are on your best behavior. All right. Talk to you guys soon.